Hey there, how are you doing? I'm Della Rucker. I am the principal of the Wise Economy Workshop, and I'm so glad you've taken the time to join me today. For those of you that perhaps don't know me, um, I am an urban planner and an economic developer by training, but more importantly, I focus on questions of how we are dealing with the transition from the world that most of us came up in, what I often term the industrial era, to a very different economic and social and cultural era that we're moving into, whether we like it or not. Um, a lot of times I call that the fusion era. There's other names floating around for it right now. But my primary focus is on understanding how our present and increasingly our future are going to be very different from our past, and not just in terms of our sort of day-to-day surface interactions, but in terms of the very deep structures and assumptions and systems that underlie our communities, our businesses and organizations, and even our own thinking. So in January of this month, we talked on this live about future ready mindset, and how our thinking needs to change. This month, we've been talking about future ready business. And if you go back on this account, you will find the previous video from February, as well as the videos from January, including a great interview with Christina Aldan and Rachel Hawkins on the role of emotional and mental resilience in building a future ready mindset. If what you hear today or on those videos is interesting, you can connect in a few different ways. If you're looking for speaking or workshops or consulting or coaching, you can find that at my website, which is wiseeconomy.com. And if you're interested in learning more about what does it mean to be future ready and how does that interact with the things that are going on in our world today on a daily basis, that kind of push me, pull you between that past and that future. I write about that on a regular basis on my Substack newsletter, which is at wiseeconomy.substack.com. So you can get a taste in either of those places. I'm also on a lot of the social media. But what I wanted to take a little time to talk about today is one of those points of that push me, pull you. In a lot of our businesses and organizations, we rely on business advice, often from lawyers, also often from other professionals. And a lot of that advice tends to be around putting moats and protections around our business. And that probably made a lot of sense 50, 75, 100 years ago, when the balance of power was very different from what it is in reality today. And if you are working in a business, especially if you're working in a business, which is pretty much all of them, that need talented, capable people who can do problem solving and do problem solving both independently and collaboratively, you know that the dynamic has totally changed from what your great grandfather probably would have assumed. I know that's the case with mine. So, what we're going to talk about today is how to push back, or how to negotiate that tension when you have advisors, legal advisors to be sure, but also other kinds of advisors who are counseling you to put up the gates, protect, deny, and try to avoid being transparent. I've been writing a lot on transparency on the Substack newsletter that I mentioned at wiseeconomy.substack.com. So today we're gonna talk about where that conflict may lie between the future's demand for transparency and our employees and customers' demand for transparency, and what we may be hearing from lawyers, from business advisors, from mentors, etc. Now, let's be really clear about one thing here. I am not a lawyer. I am not a lawyer. I can't even play one on TV. For those of you that reference actually makes sense too. So this is not legal advice. When you want legal advice, by all means, engage your attorney. What I'm trying to give you here in these next few minutes is a bit of a framework on understanding where that legal advising or other kinds of non-legal business advising may be, and what you may face as a reality with your customers, your clients, your employees that might be very different from the assumptions that they're working from. Maybe working from unconsciously, probably working from unconsciously. So this is not legal advice. This is some perspective and some insights that might help you sort of navigate that tension between conventional ways of doing things in our businesses and organizations and the way we probably need to do them today, the way our clients and customers and employees are increasingly going to demand that they be done today. So I've got a few notes down here under the camera. It's old school, like paper and everything. So let's look at three particular situations where that tension can come into play. And the first one we're going to talk about is salaries. Now, salary transparency or salary lack of transparency was always, for the last 100 years, in most cases has been sort of the standard operating procedure. Nobody's supposed to know what anybody else's salary is. That's like the assumption that a lot of us came up under. Your salary is between you and your employer. That makes sense from the perspective of protecting the employee's privacy, but it can also be abused and is often abused. A lot of the challenges, a lot of the conflict that we have had, a lot of the injustice that has been done in the space of income inequality stems directly from that, facade of privacy. What do I mean by that? Well, we've got extensive documentation over decades that shows that women, people of minority backgrounds, people from a variety of perspectives that are not the mainstream, or a variety of backgrounds that are not the mainstream, however that's defined, they don't get paid the same amount for the same work. That's very well proven statistically. And we might have people in our world these days who want to pretend that all of that isn't the case and sort of try to sweep that under the rug. But the reality is that's the reality. And your employees are increasingly finding that information about how their salary compares to people who don't look like them but are doing the same work. They're finding that. They are already finding that through anonymous chats within your own company and through comparison to folks in other companies, through Reddit streams, through group chats, through a whole host of forms of communication that you have no control over. So they're already finding that information. And so if you are underpaying somebody compared to somebody who's comparable, what maybe you even have a good reason for doing it, but they're finding that information. So trying to pretend that there's this facade of, oh, we don't share, employee information, employee payment information, employee salary information. It's as though the back door were open and frankly, your tail end is already hanging out in the wind. They already know. And if they don't know now, as soon as they're curious about it, they're going to know. So what do you do about that? Well, obviously, if you go and tell somebody that my salary is XYZ and I haven't given you permission to do that, or I haven't put that information out there myself, you could be into a case of violating my privacy. But what you can always do, of course, is put forward anonymized aggregate information. Now you have to connect back to a source that indicates that, gives people assurance that your information is accurate and that you're not trying to hide something or snow them. But you can provide that information. Our average salary for XYZ position is X. Our average salary for women in this position is X prime. Our average salary for people who are of color is Y. Even if the political environment or your board of directors or somebody out in the public who screams and hollers doesn't want you to do that, that's in your best interest because that's crucial to the trust of your employees. And we all know that finding and replacing good employees is unbelievably expensive and difficult, and it's not getting any easier. So that's one situation where transparency was never part of the conversation before, and complete and utter, put it all out, in the world. By the way, that does happen to public sector employees. If you work for the public sector, chances are your salary is a matter of public record. You know that if you work in the public sector. But that kind of transparency, public sector does that on purpose because it, again, maintains transparency. That same pressure will come to bear on your business. And if you haven't seen that yet, there are two possibilities. One is that your employees haven't asked that question yet, but they will. And the second is that they're already asking that question and sharing that information and compiling that information and working together to understand where they're standing and what they need to do to change that, or what they need to do if they can't change that, and you're just not aware of it. So that's a real reality, especially if you have younger employees who are much more adept at finding and collaborating on information like that. So that's one. The second issue is errors. Now, I talked about this a couple of months ago. If you go back into this, the thread or the videos behind this one, you may find one that talks about how to give a good apology. And that's a very specific skill, but it's part of a larger question of how do you keep errors when somebody's made an error, either intentionally or non-intentionally. How do you keep that from blowing up in your face? A lot of times the conventional wisdom, and you may get this from legal advisors or from business advisors, is don't say anything, don't talk to anything, don't admit to anything, because we don't want to be exposed to the liability. The reality is that you're probably already exposed to the liability, because it is so much easier, infinitely easier today than it was when a lot of these sort of standard operating procedures were developed that we all learned and put in our heads. It's so much easier today to find that information. You don't have to be an investigative reporter. You don't have to be an expert in your field. You basically just need people who have some good computer skills. And your error, intentional or unintentional, it will come to light. The ability to get away with something and get away with it for decades it's not there anymore. So if they're advising you to keep your lips shut, not say anything, not admit anything, they're probably giving you short-term good advice, but long-term bad advice. Because if it is found that not only did you make this error, but you covered it up, that's going to hit you even harder. And I had some good examples of that in the Substack from, I think it was yesterday. Not only does covering up a situation typically get you higher fines, higher penalties, etc., but when that information comes to light through people who found it out without your being honest about it, your trust, your relationships, your suppliers, your employees, you've damaged your trust with all of those. So the information is going to come out, 95% sure. And when it's found that you weren't transparent about it, you got a problem. Now, if there's an ongoing investigation and you can't say something because that might tip off the person who has done something, that's a legitimate reason. But you don't just say, we're not talking. You say, we're doing an investigation. I can't talk about that more right now because we don't want to inadvertently damage our investigation, or, or tip off somebody who's done something that was not acceptable. And if you're interested in how to make a good public apology when it's not a case of an investigation or anything like that, take a look back at that video in this feed. And if you go onto my Substack, you can find an article that talks about how to give a really good apology. And there's a great case study in there. So the third one I want to talk about is a little bit more, complicated, a little more nuanced. And it's a question of greenwashing. Greenwashing is when a company claims to be doing something that is environmentally sustainable or environmentally non-damaging. We'll put it that way. It covers a whole lot of doing things and also not doing things. And for a very large segment of companies, investors, and customers, and potential employees, sustainability remains a very, very, very important component. And a lot of companies will put out information about something that they're doing that is sustainable or green or environmentally friendly. And we're all familiar with companies getting accused of greenwashing. In greenwashing, it's not a formal term, right? But it basically means that you're not telling the truth about what you're doing. And in the case of anything involving environmental sustainability, sustainable materials, etc., It's really hard. Nobody's going to be perfect on those counts, simply because there's certain amounts of information that we still don't have access to. You don't always know for sure where your supplies are coming from. You don't always know, and that's improving. Blockchain is has the potential to make a very big difference in that if we can stop, you know, dismissing it because of connections to cryptocurrency debacles. But the ability to lay out very clearly what you are doing for the sake of environmental sustainability, lessening your environmental impact, etc., that can be really complicated, in part because you don't know, and in part because it requires a whole lot of information. And 98% of people who look at your marketing or your social media or your public statements aren't going to want to really chase down all of those details. They don't want to read a 97-page environmental sustainability report. But you may still need to have that. You probably still need to have that. And it needs to identify where you have clarity and where you don't have clarity, where you're doing a good job and where you need to improve. And that, again, we were all taught coming up that you don't want to admit your mistakes and you don't want to admit where you're not perfect. But again, that transparency of information, that easy access to information means that if you're not making the best possible effort to make that information publicly available, you are at risk of getting accused of greenwashing or worse. Again, they're going to find out. Somebody's going to find out, and that's going to have ramifications for you. They might be huge, they might be tiny, but there will be ramifications. The easiest thing to do is to put that information out and be honest about where you are on that continuum. Nobody is perfectly sustainable who is producing a product for sales. It's somewhere in that line. You're using resources that, could conceivably be used for something better, quote unquote. You're not going to have perfect scores on all of the environmental impact elements. But increasingly, people understand that. When environmental issues first came kind of into popular consciousness, I definitely encountered people who wanted to be purist about that, who wanted to only support companies that were absolutely 100% sustainable on everything. But what we've learned, and I think what most of us who care about those kinds of issues have learned over the last 20 or 30 years, is that it's a work in progress. It's a continuum. It's not a binary. Another thing that I talk about a lot of times is we got very used to having binaries. Yes, no, on, off. But with so many issues involving human life and human communities in business, we don't have continuums. We don't have binaries. It's not yes or no. It's not on or off. What it is where do you fall on the scale? Excuse me. Good timing. So being honest about where you're falling on that conceptual scale is far more important and far less risky than claiming to be something that you're not. So keep in mind, they're going to find out. It never fails. And the internet, it never forgets. Even if you wipe a website, it's still there. The people who know how to find it will find it. We're seeing that with the federal government's deletion of certain websites right now. You can still get them. You can get them through the Wayback Machine. You can get them through people and organizations who are archiving and maintaining, and in many cases, such as with some of the reproductive health information that's been removed, it's being put up again by another entity. So it's never gone. And that's a very, very profound difference from where we've been pretty much ever in human history. So it's not too much of a wonder that we still sometimes are acting and assuming based on those old assumptions about being able to control information and sort of control the narrative. Controlling the narrative is almost impossible anymore. You can tweak it, you can form it, you can push it, and sometimes you can control it for the short term, but not for the long term. And I hope you're doing whatever you're doing with an eye to the long term, not just to getting through and making a buck for tomorrow. So I've had a couple of questions come in. So let me try to answer these quickly before we hit the half-hour mark. So this is really a good question. Where are the limits, right? Where are the limits to transparency? You can't just put everything out there in the universe. Where's the limits in this future-ready environment, world that we're moving into? So it depends on your business. But in general, if a piece of transparency, if being transparent about something will hurt people, especially people whose ability to fight back against you individually might be a little limited. It's ethically and probably legally appropriate not to make it transparent in that fashion. When we talked about salaries a few minutes ago, that's a good example, right? If you say Dallas Rucker's salary is X, depending on the relationship and the agreement that you have with the employee, that might be okay, like I said, with public sector employees, but that could be a violation of my privacy. Certainly with any kind of medical information. That's why we have HIPAA in the US, which is a set of laws that basically govern the very limited circumstances in which a doctor or anybody in healthcare can release my personal health information. Obviously, that's super sensitive. So in general, releasing in a manner that does not identify the individual is safer from in terms of navigating that that tension between being transparent and protecting private information. That would be one way to do it. Easier to do if you're a bigger company than a smaller company, right? Because if there's only one person in a given position, that's like an obvious, in which case it may make sense to collaborate with other businesses in that, in your industry or in your community, and kind of assemble aggregate salary information. Another would be when you're dealing with somebody's intellectual property, yours or others. You want to stop before you get to that. If you're dealing with a deal, like a business deal or a real estate deal, that's a little more complicated as well, because you need to be as forthright as possible about where you are in the process, but you may have limits on what you're able to say about the details, again, because that might not be fair to the other entity. Second question, with the proliferation of this kind of legacy thinking, what are things that one person can do as an individual employee to combat that? And one piece is to share information like this, to share case studies like the one I posted on the Substack a couple of days ago, a couple of case studies. And these were very big public situations that where a company got in pretty big trouble for not being transparent. That's certainly one way to go at it. There are whistleblower protections in a lot of different environments, but even before you have to go to that level, this is a conversation that I think people can have with their bosses, with their managers, with their, if you're in a position to do so, with legal advisors or with business advisors. And one of the ways that I think about this, the assumption that we can't say anything publicly because of this risk that we're going to be liable for something or the other is based on on that old model of being able to control information. But if you change the conversation, and if you're in a position to have the ability to change the conversation, and instead of saying we have to protect, say, look at what the worst case scenarios are. So what is the worst case scenario if we are public about this? If we are as transparent as we possibly can be, what's the worst case scenario there? And what is the worst case scenario if we hide this or we're not transparent about it and the dirty laundry comes out? And if you compare it in that manner, what happens if we tell the truth? What happens if we don't tell the truth and it comes out anyways? And demonstrating, we've got lots of data to show that that's what's likely to happen sooner or later. The damage here, the damage for not being transparent and being found out afterward in all sorts of different dimensions, that damage is going to be higher than the damage of being forthright. And that ranges from damage to customer and client relationships and employee relationships to lawsuits, right? Or legal implications. Anytime you've been found to cover something up, you're in a lot worse situation than if you didn't. So not everybody's going to be able to have that conversation individually. That might be a conversation that you can push for and advocate for and get as a collective. If a group of managers or a group of line workers or a collection of people are able to advocate for addressing that issue. We get a lot of times, if we're not in a position of leadership, we kind of say, well, I can't do anything. And, nobody will listen to me. Nobody will listen to me. But we've always had collective power, whether you're in a union or not. There's always more power with a group of people. When a group of people come forward and share information or advocate for change, that's always more powerful than if you try to do it by yourself. And yet, in so much of our lives, we've been taught that you have to do it yourself and you can't build that kind of collaboration. And sometimes that gets, rejected at the, even though you've come with a group of people, it can get rejected at that higher level. And sometimes, that gives you the answer about your organization or your company that you needed, you know? And then you have a different set of decisions to make. So we've gone 5 minutes over the half an hour. I hope that was helpful. I hope that you perceive kind of not only this changed reality that we live in, but also that there's some incredible benefits that come with that. Now, we're seeing a lot of pushback on that idea right now. But I think if you look at it and you think about how other situations in the very recent past have unfolded, you get a sense of how fragile not being transparent can be. And in reality, being transparent makes your situation much less fragile, much less likely to break, because there's not much that can be held against you. So I hope that's helpful. Again, if you're interested in learning more about these kind of issues, wiseeconomy.substack.com is probably going to be a great resource. You can get a little bit of that for free. You can get more of that for a very low cost. And I would encourage you to check it out. So next week, we will be talking with one of my favorite people. I have a lot of favorite people, but this guy is something special. We're going to be talking with Marco Cannon. Marco is the leader of Studio 107, which is, for Truth in Advertising, the company that I use for my marketing, my video, and my strategy. They are working in a way that is totally different from other companies that I've known in the past. But they're not the only one that's like this. So I think that what we're going to talk about with Marco is really going to be about sort of an emerging strategy for running a business in an environment that is, as we've described many times, volatile, complex, uncertain, and ambiguous. My military friends know that as VUCA. And if there's one thing that dominates the transition from something like the industrial era to this fusion era, this era that we're moving into, it's volatility. And we're living that every day. I think that people like Marco are finding a really interesting way to manage that on a business level. So I think it'll be a really insightful conversation. Again, that'll be next week and we'll go live at noon Eastern time next Thursday. And eventually, a little editing will happen to take out things like me sneezing. We will have that on the Wise Economy podcast as well. So stay tuned. And if you want to kind of stay in touch, you shoot me a message here, or you're welcome to sign up at wiseeconomy.com. And it'll be a great way to stay in touch. Alrighty. Take care of yourself. Have a wonderful Thursday. If you're in the Midwest, I hope you're not freezing your tail off like I'm going to in a few minutes when I go out. And I'll talk to you soon. Take care.